So one of the things that I really want to sit down and talk to you guys today about is something that's been on my mind. It's something that just continues to frustrate me, probably as a veteran MMO player, about the current state of MMORPGs. But it's going to be focusing in on kind of one key aspect. And because I have a kind of a focused approach, note that there's some nuance and there's some other systems that are not going to be talked about in this game, which in turn can make what I'm saying like not sound complete. It might not sound like a full thought. And so note that this might end up being a series if you guys are interested in it. But beyond that, this is something I just kind of want to talk about, and I'd love to always get your thoughts and perspective. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the channel. My name is Brian, and returning subs, you're amazing. That's what you get for subscribing. Free compliments with videos. So today's really going to be focusing on the two concepts of the player-driven economy and getting the highest or the best gear from the hardest content, and having these systems kind of seemingly at odds with one another. And to set a little context, Final Fantasy XI was the game that I came in and just adored. And it's still to this day the game that I return to occasionally, the game that I really kind of judge, at least, maybe nostalgically, maybe incorrectly, all these other games, especially like when I look at 14 or new MMOs out on the horizon. And New World is an example of that. At least that's currently on my radar. So the player-driven economy, I think, is a real strength to MMOs that help kind of offset downtime in content delivery. I think the theme park design can work when married with the sandbox approach, in which that you have a way of onboarding players, getting them connected to the world, but then ultimately you have systems in place that allow players to make their own fun, because players will be able to make more fun and more content and more stories faster than the developers will in this case. And I think Final Fantasy 1.0 to 2.0 is a really good example of the Great Gubu Wall. If anybody remembers that, is that players had an impact and have put themselves in the story. And I think that's a really cool thing to witness, especially, almost, 7-8 years later in this case. So I think economies, especially when you have open trade, and I just wait, hold up on those comments, just wait. When open trade allows players to create player-driven goals. And yes, that means, and I would sit here and say, yes, I would love it if somebody who was just doing casual content or crafting content, gathering content, just kind of living in their world, their game, made enough money. And then if somebody wanted to sell the best gear, the best in slot gear that they acquired from doing some crazy challenge, then they should be able to do that. And that's what gil or any in-game currency, in my mind, should be used to facilitate that trade, because you could be doing 1,000 things, all of your choice of what you find fun, and then being able to go and participate in the gear economy if you so choose. And shifting that to the best content, or the hardest content should drop the best gear. I think the flaw in that mindset doesn't take into account all the changes that we've seen MMOs make over the last 10 years with glamour and transmog. But the other flaw that I personally have, you don't have to share this same mindset. The other flaw that I think this has is that it treats the gear as the trophy. And when you take the gear and you attach like glamour to it, when you change its looks and appearance, that it's just a stat number at that point. And typically, especially when, in certain games, gear without perks is just a stat number increase. It's really nothing else. It's a stat stick, I guess, for a lack of a better term. So you have the stat stick, you change its look, so you automatically, like within minutes, remove its trophiness. And so I think that the hardest content should have trophies. I think there should be something that can help, show that you can show off, that you can highlight, you can do different things. Certain content, like in Destiny 2, was really good at this, is if you clear content, like you get a halo or you get some kind of glow effect for your character for like a period of time, like usually typically a week over week period. And that was really great because it didn't have that stat impact. Now, Destiny has no player trading, so shifting this back to Final Fantasy, for example, if, for example, you were able to clear the hardest content in the game, you got this drop, and whether you wanted it or not, who cares? But let's say you didn't really want it, and it turns out there was somebody willing to pay for it. Somebody in-game that was like, hey, I've got 5 million gil. I got 50 million gil. I just sit here and craft all day. I want to take that weapon and I want to enhance it, or I want to do something different to that. I want to kind of augment it in some way, and then I'm going to either use it or I'm going to resell it. Having that economy of trade that drives us all to work together in different ways, I think helps a couple of different things. I think it helps cut down on toxicity, especially when you look at, like, hey, that raid actually doesn't drop gear. It just drops materials. And then crafters take those materials and they turn them into gear. Yes, you're going to have your big free companies that are well organized. They're going to have their crafters that are supporting the raid, so to speak, and they might actually be the same players, or they might not be. But then overall in the economy, you're going to have casual players actively supplying raiders with the content that they need, and having that dependency or slight dependency on each other helps bring us together more as a community than it ends up separating us apart by get good, you filthy casual, or, or I guess that, I don't know what we would, how we would make fun of hardcore players. I don't know, get a life, something like that, maybe. So essentially, I think, when we look at it, it's like we've already separated the trophiness from the gear, but we haven't separated that mindset. We look at the stat, the stat stick that the gear represents in MMOs, and we put that up on a pedestal, when at the end of the day, that's just some kind of number by your name. And then we already have all these skating, we have all these retention mechanics that allow people to slowly kind of catch up to the game itself. Now, these systems, and if Final Fantasy XIV flipped on a dime, changed all of this today, there would be massive problems. Like, this would be a massive rework in terms of its design philosophy. And so don't hear, or think that right now I'm sitting here advocating for such massive change with the game itself. So let's focus in on the negatives real quick. Obviously, I think it helps incentivize RMT, like people wanting to go in a real money trade to buy, gil or whatever in-game currency that you're looking for, to go and try to pull that into, their pockets. And so it incentivizes that. So if there aren't systems that are in place to kind of support and negate that aspect, you're only essentially calling for massive inflation as players continue to go and farm up in terms of bot or thievery or etc. to sell that money to a player who's going into the market and say, like, well, I would like a basic weapon, but the game wants me to grind out for 100,000 hours just to make the gil required to buy like a level 5 sword. That's a downside of that aspect. And so you have to obviously have supporting systems and control mechanisms that are driven within kind of those mindsets. And so that's not an easy thing. Player-driven economies, I don't think, are an easy thing. But I think they're a thing that, again, like I said, brings the community together, has players work together, and then essentially gives players player-driven goals, especially in terms and when there is content drought. Because it all comes back down to, because I think about it constantly, if gear wasn't a trophy, but it was something that you could sell, you could trade, and maybe we could sit here and say bind on equip is perfectly fine, so that way you have gear being pulled out of the economy rather than this continual flowing in of gear itself. Maybe bind on equip is that, but if you're not going to equip it or use the gear, to be able to sell it to somebody who might be willing to buy it, I think that's a real positive thing. And that's just where I'm going to stand on it. I think that's where I'll probably always stand on that mindset, and that's probably just because of how I grew up with MMOs. Now, all that being said, it's that you're definitely welcome to disagree. Like, this is a dialogue, this is about that conversation, and I don't expect this, or at least my words, to change anybody's minds, but I just wanted to set some context. I always like these videos as good ways to point back to when I talk about a game, positive and negative, when I critique a game, positive and negative. The idea is that hopefully you know more about me and my viewpoint on a particular subject, so that you know to whether you're like, oh yeah, I like what he said about this, or he's really kind of wrong about that. So we can kind of dismiss him and go about our happiest days, and that's perfectly fine. I think context is key, especially when it comes to opinions on video games, because it's like I believe that everybody's opinion is valid as long as you understand the context of where they're coming from. Like, if you're a massive PvP player, and it's like, yeah, and you want to talk about PvP, that's great. If you're a massive PvP who doesn't touch PvE, your opinion on PvE is just as valid, but coming from the context of that, well, you really don't do PvE. So it's always good to know where people are coming from in that case. As always, I'd love to know your thoughts. Thanks for being here. Thanks for being awesome. Hopefully you have a fantastic day. This has been Brian for Ginger Prime. I love you faces, and hope to see you in my next one. But until then, take care. This video is sponsored by me, Ginger Prime. Hopefully you'll check out my podcast channel, Ginger Gaming Radio, which we have lots of guests, lots of great conversations, and even more highlights. Links are in the description below. Let me know what you think. Thanks.